Joining me from London is Daniel Miller. He's principal investigator on the Global Social Media Impact Study. And from California, Pamela Rutledge is director of the Media Psychology Research Center. Thanks so much, both of you, for joining us. Let's start with you, Daniel, in London, because you basically are the principal investigator on a 5-year project into the effects of social media. I mean, it's almost there. You were the dawn of social media just 5 years ago. What's been the global impact? What are your findings so far?
I think the main point that we wanted to make is that people are making all these claims about social media, that it does something to attention span, it changes friendship. And we kind of wondered, is that going to be equally true for an IT professional in India or a factory worker in China? So what we wanted to find out was the effects for each local area, and they are very different. So if I took one site, for example, we have one on the border of Syria and Turkey, then you find this is a traditional Muslim site where actually public social media, things like Facebook, turned out to be deeply conservative, much more conservative than even offline life because of things like surveillance by family, whereas private social media like WhatsApp really changes things like gender relations. Young men and young women can talk to each other in a way they couldn't before. By contrast, in England, where I'm working, we find a very English use of social media. The English get very kind of embarrassed easily. And they have a sort of technique where they use social media to keep people at just the right distance, not too warm and not too cold. If you know the English, kind of that's what they're like. And so when people make these grand claims about social media, we just feel that our research will help kind of nuance this to say, well, who are you talking about? And can we say something about the impact for that particular population?
Pamela, it's interesting what Dennis was saying about the English using social media to keep people at bay. Here in the United States, it's quite the opposite, isn't it? How do you think social media here in the US and generally around the world has changed the way we communicate and what we communicate about?
Well, I think fundamentally people want to communicate. And so what you're seeing, especially across these different cultures, is the cultural overlay over the drive to connect. So in the US, there's a much freer, as it sounds like, sense of connectivity and sharing than there might be in the UK, where it sounds like people use social media with a little more reserve. But what we see is that sort of cultural overlay over that primary drive. And coming as a psychologist, I'm looking at the primary drivers. And so I'm not at all surprised to see these variations in how we want to connect.
But it is, Pamela, it is instant, isn't it? Everything is so much more instant on social media. Instant gratification, instant news. How does that change us psychologically?
Okay, so there's this presumption that getting news faster and getting information faster is somehow morally inferior to having to hang around and wait. And so I don't actually buy into that logic because, in fact, having things faster increases your productivity. It does, however, change our assumptions about how we deal with each other, how we deal with companies and brands. So there's a sort of take notice on what the expectations are and the meaning that people assign to speed.
Daniel, how do you think the world has changed in terms of social media's immediacy when it comes to business, education, social communication?
I think that actually what we find is that social media these days is a range. It's not just one platform. And therefore, when you use the word immediacy, it depends what you're talking about. Actually, one of the things you can do with social media is park information somewhere. Respond to it maybe after an hour, respond to it in a couple of days. So it provides different kind of registers of time. You may get information immediately, but you don't have to react to it. And it gives you more flexibility. Actually, the problem is when I'm talking to you, that's immediacy. I have to think of something immediately, say it back, and I haven't really had time necessarily to sort of store it, think about it. So in some ways, social media can actually be a more profound form of communication because of that delay. So the idea, I think, that people have cottoned onto in social media is the range, that now we have the WeChats and the WhatsApps and the Facebooks and the Instagram. Each one can be used in different kind of registers, and that helps us actually kind of control our communication.
I'm glad you brought up control of communications, Daniel, because we've seen examples in the news media where people use applications like Twitter, for example, to try and get their message out. Sometimes at times of immense confusion. For example, the Gaza war last year, or just recently in the Paris attacks. How are people using this to try and influence public opinion and also global opinion, sometimes in a very fast-moving way?
Okay. I can give an instance in one of our field sites. This was in northern Chile. And at the time the field worker was there was a huge earthquake, very bad earthquake. Now, what you found was that in the first couple of days, people, as in Paris, they simply want to reassure others that they're okay and they haven't been, that they're still alive, basically, and they're safe. But then they realize that the world's media attention is on them because of that earthquake. And this is the kind of place where normally people don't really get to hear the voices of those people. So if you look at the way they used Instagram, then actually the Instagram posts after a couple of days were all about, okay, now you're looking at me, let me tell you something about what it's like here. Let me tell you about the needs we have, not just in relation to the earthquake, but generally because this is a poor area, you don't pay attention to us. So they know it hasn't changed news in the sense of, you know, for one day, you maybe have the world's attention. Next day, there's something else going on somewhere else. You haven't got it for very long. But they recognize that, and they see social media as a means by which they can give voice. They can say, okay, while you're looking at me, let me tell you something about what it's really like here. And that for them is a very positive aspect of social media use, because it's not just, as it were, other journalists coming in and making the story. They feel they get to say something themselves and show something about themselves. 2 days later, that's gone. The news has moved on.
Daniel, that's a really interesting point. Pamela, pick up on that, the way that groups can become engaged, but also can be disengaged very quickly by social media. I'm thinking of the hashtag, for example, Bring Back Our Girls, with Boko Haram and the kidnapping in northern Nigeria. That became a global sensation with the US First Lady part of it, lots of public pressure, and then suddenly 2 years later the girls are still missing.
Well, yeah, that is a problem, but people have only the ability to sustain attention for so long. But what's brilliant about this is that for the first time, we are seeing actual voices, and we are hearing about stories that we never would have heard about before. And so you can no longer stick your head down in the sand to the degree that you could. And so to me, it's sort of the thin edge of the wedge for empathy, that we're starting to hear actual stories, not curated information. The news does a good job. They try very hard to isolate important points, but they lose a certain amount of the local texture and the emotion when they do that. And social media is very powerful that. And I think what Daniel brought up a great point about the choices that people have about how they communicate, which is really a profound difference.
Daniel, about curation, because the news media has traditionally done that job, but if there's no curation, you know, basically telling people what's relevant or not, you can get things where people are against vaccines and create a huge hullabaloo online and a big presence, even though they may be factually wrong, and create harm. How does that work in social media vis-a-vis other media?
I think the first thing to say is there's nothing new about that.
Right.
I mean, basically, at any particular stage, if you think about prior to these media, the main mechanisms would have been gossip. They would have been, you know, hearsay. You didn't actually have the possibilities of that kind of keynote information that you could really trust. So in some ways, the more different sources of information there are around, the more people have an opportunity to get to know them, to work out which ones they might trust, which ones they might not. But having said that, there's an element of what you've just said, which is that this is social media. So because it's very much social, it's about talking with your friends and relatives, etc., it's still going to have that element of gossip. It's still going to be, I'm going to not necessarily tell you the thing that maybe is going to be most factual, but the thing that is most sensational, or the thing that you may listen to and make them think that, you know, I'm somebody really clever, etc. So, of course, we will use social media in that way, but those genres were pre-existent. They simply migrate onto social media, which gives them new possibilities. I wouldn't say that as a result of social media, people in general are kind of spreading less factual or more factual information. It just becomes part of a wider mix.
Pamela, what's the downside of social media? We've just talked about the upside and how wonderfully empowering it is for everyone, but is that so?
Well, I mean, there's a couple of downsides, and I hate to. I'm a sort of a glass half full person when it comes to technology and social media, so I hate to go there too much. But it is very compelling to be engaged socially and to have all of this interactivity. So it's really important for people to achieve some balance. You know, it's such a powerful tool, and we don't throw kids in a pool without teaching them to swim. We don't give them the keys to the car without teaching them to drive, but we give them a smartphone and we give them a Facebook account. These are very powerful tools, and social media is so much more than just Facebook. So there's a lot of learning about privacy, about citizenship online, about how to behave, about how to create media, how to distribute it ethically. So there's a whole range of skills that need to be taught to be a good digital citizen.
Daniel, you're an anthropologist in an age of social media, and you started off this segment by saying people use it so differently. Give us a couple of examples of how, even in this hyper-connected world, people use it so differently.
I think that if you look at sort of general terms, you can say that people tend to use social media in balance with what's going on in their lives outside. So for those people who've lived in traditional, close families with lots of intense interaction, for them social media is actually almost a break. They may not have had much experience of privacy before. For them, the first experience of privacy might be having your own kind of phone where you can talk to somebody. And yet when we talk about, the societies that we're more familiar with, you have the discussion which we just had, which is actually it's a threat to privacy. Similarly, you'll find, let's say, places where people don't have good access for education. Actually, for them, social media, and particularly things like YouTube, that now is their education. They can bypass the lack of access and get in contact with all sorts of interesting material. Whereas in societies where people have a high level of education available, it's seen as a kind of distraction. So in every instance, you have to say the impact of social media is going to be relative to the situation those people were previously in. It can make things better, it can make things worse, but it's always about how other social circumstances work for that population.
Fascinating stuff. Daniel Miller, thank you so much in London, and Pamela Routledge in California as well.